The photograph captured the moment perfectly. October 1940, Rome. Benito Mussolini stood on the balcony of Palazzo Venezia, chest thrust forward, jaw set in that familiar aggressive pose he'd practiced 10,000 times in mirrors. Below him, a crowd of 40,000 Italians roared their approval as he declared Italy's entrance into a new war. "We are going to break the back of Greece," he shouted, his voice echoing off the ancient stones. The crowd erupted. Il Duce, they believed, would deliver another glorious victory for the new Roman Empire. But in a borrowed office in Berlin, Adolf Hitler read the telegram announcing Italy's invasion of Greece and threw it across the room. He hadn't been consulted. He hadn't been informed. His ally had just opened a new front in the Balkans without telling him, and Hitler knew immediately what it meant. More German troops, more German resources, more German blood spent cleaning up Italian mistakes. He was right. 3 weeks after Mussolini's triumphant speech, Italian soldiers were dying in the mountains of Albania, pushed back by a Greek army that wasn't supposed to win. The Greeks, outnumbered and outgunned on paper, had somehow stopped the Italian advance cold, then counterattacked with a ferocity that shocked Rome. Italian divisions retreated in chaos, equipment was abandoned, entire units surrendered, and in his office in Palazzo Venezia, Mussolini stared at the reports coming from the front and felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the cold grip of genuine fear. The invasion of Greece was supposed to be easy. Mussolini had told his generals it would take 2 weeks, maybe 3. Greece was small, weak, divided by internal politics. Italy had an army of 500,000 men, modern aircraft, tanks, artillery. The Greeks had what? A few divisions of peasants with outdated rifles? It should have been a parade march to Athens, another jewel in Mussolini's crown, proof that Italy was Germany's equal as a military power. Instead, it became a nightmare. The Italian Ninth Army crossed the Albanian border into Greece on October 28th, expecting token resistance. They found Greek soldiers who'd spent the night preparing defensive positions in the mountains, who knew every pass and valley, who fought with the desperation of men defending their homeland. The Italian advance stalled within days. Then the Greeks counterattacked. Then the Italians began to retreat. Then the retreat became a rout. By mid-November, Greek forces had pushed into Albania itself, capturing town after town that Italy had held for years. Italian soldiers surrendered by the thousands, exhausted, frostbitten, demoralized. The Albanian winter was brutal, and the Italian army hadn't brought winter clothing because Mussolini had promised this would be over before the snow fell. Now his men were dying of exposure in mountain passes, their bodies found frozen in positions that suggested they'd simply stopped moving and let the cold take them. Mussolini received the casualty reports in his office: 13,000 dead, 25,000 wounded, 50,000 sick with pneumonia, dysentery, frostbite, and the numbers kept climbing. He read them twice, then a third time, as if reading them again might change what they said. Then he looked up at his military secretary and said something he'd never said before about an Italian military operation: "Get me the Germans." The phone call to Berlin was brief. Mussolini's voice, usually so confident, carried an unfamiliar note. He needed German support in Greece. Not much, he insisted. Just some equipment. Perhaps a few divisions to stabilize the line. Nothing major. Hitler listened in silence, then said he would consider it. After he hung up, he turned to his generals and said what they were all thinking. "The Italians have given us a new front we don't need, and now we have to win their war for them." But Greece wasn't Mussolini's only failure. In North Africa, another disaster was unfolding, and this one threatened to destroy Italy's entire position in the Mediterranean. Marshal Rodolfo Graziani commanded 250,000 Italian troops in Libya, facing a British force in Egypt that numbered barely 30,000. The mathematics seemed simple. Italy should have swept through Egypt, seized the Suez Canal, perhaps pushed all the way to Palestine. Mussolini had given the order to advance in September 1940, expecting to hear news of a triumphant march to Cairo within weeks. Instead, Graziani's army crept 60 miles into Egypt, then stopped and built defensive camps. The marshal sent messages to Rome explaining that his men needed more supplies, better equipment, time to prepare proper logistics. Mussolini sent back increasingly angry telegrams demanding action. Graziani's army sat in the desert, waiting. Then in December, the British attacked. Operation Compass was supposed to be a limited raid, a quick strike to disrupt the Italian positions. Instead, it became a catastrophic rout. British and Commonwealth forces smashed through the Italian defenses, encircled entire divisions, captured generals and colonels, and thousands of enlisted men who seemed almost relieved to be taken prisoner. The Italian army in North Africa didn't just retreat, it disintegrated. By February 1941, the British had advanced 500 miles, captured Benghazi, and taken 130,000 Italian prisoners. They'd done it with a force that never numbered more than 40,000 men. The mathematical impossibility of it made the defeat even more humiliating. How do you lose 130,000 soldiers to an enemy force one-third your size? Mussolini knew the answer, even if he couldn't say it out loud yet. You lose because your army is poorly trained, poorly equipped, poorly led, and doesn't believe in what it's fighting for. You lose because you've built an empire on propaganda rather than industrial strength. You lose because you're not actually a great power, no matter how many speeches you give from balconies. The phone call to Berlin this time was even harder. Mussolini needed German troops in North Africa, not just equipment now, actual divisions, German soldiers to stop the British advance and recapture what Italy had lost. Hitler agreed, but the price was clear, even if unspoken. Germany would now command operations in North Africa. Italy would become the junior partner in its own theater of war. Erwin Rommel arrived in Tripoli in February 1941 with the first elements of what would become the Africa Corps. He took one look at the Italian positions, the Italian equipment, the Italian morale, and sent a report back to Berlin that was brutally honest. The Italians were finished as an effective fighting force. They could hold defensive positions if properly supported, but any offensive operations would have to be German-led with German troops. Mussolini read the German assessment and felt something crack inside his chest. It wasn't anger exactly. It was worse than anger. It was the beginning of understanding, but he still had one more illusion to lose. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Mussolini immediately offered Italian troops for the Eastern Front. This wasn't a request for help. This was Italy volunteering, trying to prove it could still contribute as an equal partner. Mussolini sent the Italian Expeditionary Corps in Russia, 62,000 men, to fight alongside German forces in the invasion. He presented it as proof of Italian martial spirit, of the deep bond between fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. What he didn't say, what he couldn't admit even to himself yet, was that he was desperate to show that Italy could still fight effectively, that the failures in Greece and North Africa were aberrations, that Italian soldiers, properly employed, were the equal of any in Europe. The Eastern Front destroyed that illusion too. Italian troops in Russia fought bravely in many engagements. Individual units performed well. But the overall picture was damning. The Italian army lacked the equipment for Russian winter warfare. Italian trucks broke down in the cold, Italian weapons jammed, Italian soldiers, pulled from Mediterranean villages, froze in temperatures they'd never imagined existed. And when Soviet forces counterattacked, Italian divisions crumbled faster than their German counterparts. By late 1942, German commanders on the Eastern Front were quietly requesting that Italian units not be placed in critical sectors. They were considered unreliable, not because the soldiers lacked courage, but because they lacked everything else: proper winter gear, adequate anti-tank weapons, reliable communications equipment, sufficient ammunition. The industrial gap between Italy and the real great powers had never been more obvious. Mussolini received reports from the Eastern Front in his office in Rome, and now when he read them, his hands shook slightly. Not from anger, from something closer to despair. The pattern was undeniable now. Greece, North Africa, Russia. Everywhere Italian forces fought, they needed German support. Everywhere Italian forces advanced, they eventually retreated. Everywhere Italian forces stood, they eventually broke. The private conversations began to change. Count Galeazzo Ciano, Mussolini's son-in-law and foreign minister, kept a diary throughout the war. In it, he recorded conversations with Mussolini that revealed the dictator's growing awareness of Italy's true position. In April 1941, after the German invasion of Greece had succeeded where Italy's had failed, Mussolini said to Ciano, "The Greeks have made me look ridiculous. I will never forgive them." But by late 1941, the tone had shifted. Ciano recorded Mussolini saying, "The Italian people are not warlike. They have become soft." It was the beginning of blame shifting, but also the beginning of recognition. The problem wasn't just the generals or the equipment. The problem was deeper. By 1942, Mussolini's private statements had become even more bitter. He told Ciano, "The Italian race is ruined. We need 5 centuries of different breeding to recover." The racism in the statement was typical of fascist ideology, but underneath it was a dawning realization. Italy couldn't compete with Germany militarily, and everyone knew it. The public Mussolini still gave speeches about Italian greatness and inevitable victory. The private Mussolini was beginning to understand that Italy had become exactly what he'd spent 20 years insisting it wasn't: a second-rate power dependent on a stronger ally. The evidence kept accumulating. In March 1941, the Italian Navy engaged British forces at the Battle of Cape Matapan. On paper, the Italian fleet was formidable: a battleship, 8 cruisers, 13 destroyers. They encountered a British force of similar size. The battle should have been close. Instead, it was a disaster. British radar-directed gunnery, which the Italians lacked, allowed the Royal Navy to devastate the Italian fleet at night. 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers were sunk. 2,400 Italian sailors died. The British lost a single torpedo bomber. The naval defeat effectively ended Italy's ability to contest British control of the central Mediterranean. Italian ships would spend most of the rest of the war in port, conserving fuel, avoiding engagement. Mussolini had dreamed of making the Mediterranean an Italian lake. Instead, Italy couldn't even protect its own supply convoys to North Africa without German air support. In November 1942, British forces launched Operation Torch, landing in French North Africa. Rommel's Africa Corps and the Italian forces in Libya were now caught between 2 Allied armies. The end was predictable. By May 1943, all Axis forces in North Africa had surrendered. 250,000 troops became prisoners, including 100,000 Italians. Mussolini's North African Empire, which he'd claimed would restore Roman glory, was gone. And it had been lost despite massive German support. The Africa Corps had fought brilliantly, but even Rommel couldn't overcome the fundamental weakness of the Axis position in North Africa. Italy couldn't supply its own army across the Mediterranean, and Germany couldn't spare the resources to do it for them. The meetings between Mussolini and Hitler during this period became increasingly uncomfortable. In April 1943, they met at Salzburg. Hitler did most of the talking, as he always did, but this time his monologues had an edge. He spoke about the need for greater Italian industrial production, about the importance of Italian troops fighting with more determination, about the necessity of Italy fully mobilizing its population for total war. The subtext was clear. Italy wasn't pulling its weight. Mussolini sat through the lectures with his jaw clenched, maintaining the posture of a fellow dictator, an equal partner. But everyone in the room could see the reality. Hitler was giving orders, Mussolini was receiving them. The relationship had fundamentally changed. After the meeting, Mussolini's personal physician noted that Il Duce looked exhausted and unwell. He'd developed a stomach ulcer. He couldn't sleep. The man who'd once radiated aggressive confidence now seemed diminished, aged beyond his 59 years. The weight of understanding was physically crushing him. In his private conversations with Ciano and other close associates, Mussolini began to speak more openly about Italy's situation. He complained that Germany treated Italy like a satellite rather than an ally. He resented the German military missions in Italy that were effectively supervising Italian war production. He bristled at German officers giving orders to Italian troops, but underneath the resentment was something else. The knowledge that Italy needed all of this because it couldn't manage its own war effort. One conversation, recorded by Ciano in May 1943, was particularly revealing. Mussolini said, "Hitler will never forgive the Italians for what we've done to his war plans. We've forced him to fight on fronts he never wanted, and we've been unable to hold any of them ourselves." It was as close as Mussolini would come at that point to admitting the central truth. Italy had become a burden to Germany rather than an asset. The final blow came in July 1943. Allied forces landed in Sicily on July 10th. The island was defended by 230,000 Italian troops and 40,000 German soldiers. Within days, Italian divisions were surrendering en masse. Entire units simply laid down their weapons and waited for the Allies to take them prisoner. The Germans fought fiercely, conducting a skillful fighting retreat, but they were vastly outnumbered and eventually evacuated to the mainland. Sicily fell in 38 days. For Mussolini, the loss of Sicily was catastrophic, not just militarily, but psychologically. This wasn't some distant front in Russia or North Africa. This was Italian soil. These were Italian soldiers defending their own homeland, and they'd collapsed almost immediately. The myth of Italian military prowess, already badly damaged, was now completely destroyed. More importantly, the Italian people knew it. On July 25, 1943, the Fascist Grand Council met in Rome and voted to remove Mussolini from power. King Victor Emmanuel III ordered his arrest. The man who'd ruled Italy for 21 years, who'd styled himself as the new Caesar, was taken into custody by Italian military police and imprisoned. The fascist regime, built on claims of Italian greatness and military strength, collapsed the moment those claims were proven false. Mussolini spent the next month and a half in various prisons, moved from location to location to prevent German rescue attempts. During this time, he had plenty of opportunity to reflect on how he'd reached this point. The man who'd promised to restore the Roman Empire had instead presided over the most humiliating military defeats in Italian history. The man who'd allied with Hitler to make Italy a great power had instead made Italy completely dependent on Germany. In September 1943, German commandos did rescue Mussolini from his mountain prison at Gran Sasso. Hitler installed him as the puppet ruler of the Italian Social Republic, a rump state in northern Italy that existed only because German troops occupied the territory. Mussolini was now explicitly what he'd been implicitly for years, a German client, ruling at German sufferance. The statements from this period are the most revealing. In the Italian Social Republic, Mussolini gave interviews and made speeches that showed a man who'd fully internalized his failure. He blamed the Italian people for being weak. He blamed the Italian bourgeoisie for lacking martial spirit. He blamed the monarchy for betraying him. He blamed everyone except himself, and the fundamental miscalculation at the heart of fascism, the belief that nationalist rhetoric and military posturing could substitute for actual industrial and military power. In one interview in late 1943, Mussolini said, "The Italian people have shown they are not worthy of their history. They have proved themselves incapable of the sacrifices necessary for greatness. The bitterness in the statement was obvious, but so was the implicit admission. Italy had failed, and Mussolini knew it. In private conversations with German officials, recorded in German documents, Mussolini was even more explicit. He acknowledged that Italy had been a burden on Germany throughout the war. He admitted that Italian military failures had forced Germany to divert resources from other fronts. He recognized that the Axis would have been stronger if Italy had remained neutral rather than fighting as Germany's ally. One German official reported Mussolini saying in early 1944, "We have been more of a hindrance than a help to Germany. Every front we've opened has required German troops to hold. Every battle we've fought has needed German support to win." It was the admission the title promised. Mussolini had realized, fully and bitterly, that Italy had become a burden to Germany. The realization came in stages, each military failure adding another piece to the picture. Greece showed that Italy couldn't even defeat a small Balkan nation without German help. North Africa showed that Italian forces collapsed against a numerically inferior British army. The Eastern Front showed that Italian soldiers couldn't survive in conditions that German soldiers endured. Cape Matapan showed that the Italian Navy was outclassed by British technology. Sicily showed that Italian troops wouldn't even fight to defend their own soil. Each failure required German intervention. Each intervention made Italy more dependent. Each increase in dependence made the relationship more unequal. By 1943, Italy wasn't Germany's partner in the Axis. It was Germany's problem, a weak ally that consumed resources without providing meaningful military contribution. Mussolini understood this. The evidence is in his private statements, in his declining health, in his bitter complaints about the Italian people. The man who'd spent 2 decades building a cult of personality around Italian strength had been forced to confront the reality of Italian weakness. The man who'd promised to restore the Roman Empire had instead presided over the most comprehensive military humiliation in Italian history. The tragedy, if you can call it that, was that Mussolini's realization came too late to matter. By the time he fully understood that Italy was a burden to Germany, Italy had already dragged Germany into multiple losing campaigns. The invasion of Greece had delayed Operation Barbarossa, possibly fatally. The North African campaign had consumed German resources that might have been decisive in Russia. The Italian collapse in 1943 had opened a new front in Western Europe that Germany couldn't afford. Hitler himself came to resent Italy's failures. In private conversations recorded by his aides, Hitler complained bitterly about having to rescue Italian forces repeatedly. He called the Italian army worthless and Italian generals incompetent. He regretted the alliance and wished Germany had stayed out of the Mediterranean entirely. The partnership that was supposed to create an Axis dominating Europe had instead created a situation where Germany's strongest ally was also its greatest liability. In April 1945, as Allied and Soviet forces closed in on what remained of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, Mussolini attempted to flee to Switzerland. He was captured by Italian partisans near Lake Como. On April the 28th, he was executed along with his mistress and several fascist officials. Their bodies were taken to Milan and hung upside down in a public square, where crowds gathered to spit on them and throw stones. It was an ignominious end for a man who'd promised to make Italy great. But perhaps it was fitting. Mussolini had built his entire political career on the claim that Italy was a warrior nation destined for empire. He'd led Italy into a war it couldn't win, alongside an ally it couldn't help. And in the end, he'd been forced to admit what he'd spent 20 years denying. Italy wasn't a great power. It was a second-rate nation that had overreached catastrophically, and its failure had made it a burden to everyone around it. The words he spoke acknowledging this burden were bitter, resentful, full of blame for everyone except himself. But they were also true. Italy had been more hindrance than help to Germany. Every Italian defeat had required German rescue. Every Italian front had consumed German resources. The alliance that was supposed to strengthen both nations had instead weakened them both. Mussolini realized it. He said it. And then he died, knowing that his life's work had been built on a lie, and that the truth had destroyed everything he'd built.